The greatest walls ever built became their cities' fatal weaknesses. This is the central paradox of ancient power, a story not of simple collapse, but of profound miscalculation. We are about to explore fortification systems that made ancient capitals seem impregnable, yet ultimately failed. You will gain a clear framework for understanding why civilizations fall, seeing history not as a list of dates, but as a recurring drama of human ambition and its limits. How did the sheer scale of a wall breed the carelessness that doomed it? What hidden flaw allowed a trickle of water to topple an empire? We will investigate iconic defenses from Constantinople to the Great Wall, dissecting the moments their legendary strength turned to dust. By the end, you will see these stone giants not as monuments to security, but as lessons in the illusions of safety. What does it truly take for a civilization to protect itself? A fortress is only as strong as the belief in it. Before the first stone was ever tested in battle, the most formidable walls in history built something even more powerful, a psychological certainty. They created an aura of invincibility that settled into the minds of everyone who saw them, friend and foe alike. This was not just about height and thickness, it was about crafting an unshakable reputation. For the citizens sheltering behind them, these ramparts were the ultimate guarantee, a promise carved in stone that they were safe, that their way of life was permanent. For any approaching army, the sight was meant to be a silent, crushing verdict. Imagine the perspective of a Roman legion, masters of disciplined warfare, first encountering the towering walls of a Hellenistic city in the east. Their own siege techniques were advanced, yet here were barriers that seemed to defy the very physics of attack, walls so high and so expertly engineered that they transformed the city into a mountainous island. The calculation for a commander shifted instantly from a question of victory to a grim assessment of cost. How many months would a siege take? How many lives would be lost scaling those sheer faces? The mere prospect of such a grueling campaign could deter conflict altogether, making the wall's greatest victory the battle it prevented. Centuries later, the Mongol horsemen who had swept across continents would halt before the staggering scale of Chinese fortifications, endless ramparts that crawled over hills and vanished into the horizon. To a warrior born on the open steppe, this was an utterly alien and daunting expression of power, a statement of territorial permanence meant to overwhelm the spirit. This psychological fortress, this collective belief in unbreachability, was the first and often most successful layer of defense. It convinced defenders they were untouchable and attackers they were outmatched. But this very certainty, this deep-seated faith in stone and mortar, would become the seed of disaster. For when your safety feels guaranteed by an immortal wall, you stop asking the most dangerous question of all. What happens if it is not the wall that fails, but everything it was meant to protect? That unshakable belief was built upon a very real and brilliant physical design. Across continents and centuries, the architects of supreme security arrived at a remarkably similar blueprint, a layered system of obstacles that turned a city into a deadly maze for any attacker. It began with the outermost challenge, a wide ditch or a moat, a water-filled trench that forced an army to stop and build bridges under a hail of arrows, all while preventing the direct placement of siege towers or battering rams against the main stone. Beyond this watery barrier rose the first line of walls, often lower and thicker, designed to absorb the initial shock of an assault. Their tops were wide walkways, allowing defenders to move freely and rain down projectiles. But the true genius lay in the spacing and shape of the towers. These were not mere decorative pillars, they were massive, projecting fortresses built right into the curtain wall. From these towers, archers and artillery could fire along the length of the wall itself, creating a lethal crossfire against any enemy soldiers who managed to reach its base. An attacker scaling a ladder would find themselves exposed on three sides, a perfect target. The gates, the inevitable weak point in any wall, became the most heavily fortified structures of all. They were often set back within a complex, tortuous entrance. Imagine approaching a towering gatehouse, only to find that the path forces you to make a sharp right turn into a narrow, enclosed courtyard, with more gates ahead and murder holes in the ceiling above. You would be funneled into a killing zone, your momentum broken, your formation scattered. Behind this first formidable wall, the ideal defense repeated the pattern. A second, even higher inner wall created another complete layer of defense. If the outer wall was breached, attackers would find themselves trapped in a barren strip of land between the two walls, exposed and vulnerable, with a fresh, unscathed defense looming above them. And at the very heart of the city, crowning a hill or central plateau, stood the final redoubt, the citadel. This was the last sanctuary, a fortress within a fortress, where the ruling elite and the treasury could hold out even if the city proper fell. This was the defensive ideal, a masterpiece of military engineering seen in the legendary triple walls of Constantinople, the immense Ishtar Gate complex of Babylon, and the concentric perfection of Carcassonne. It was a system designed to grind an attacking force into nothing, to make the cost of victory so astronomically high that no sane commander would attempt it. This blueprint represented the peak of defensive thought, the ultimate expression of how to make a capital impregnable. Yet time and again, this perfect system failed. The question is not whether these walls were strong, but why their legendary strength proved to be a mirage when tested by the unpredictable tides of history. History provides a pattern, a recurring cycle of overconfidence and collapse. To move beyond simple storytelling and truly understand why these fortresses fell, we need a clear lens, a way to dissect each legendary failure. For every capital we explore, we will examine three critical elements. First, the defensive boast. What was the extraordinary feature, the engineering marvel, the sheer scale that convinced an entire civilization they were untouchable? Was it walls that scraped the sky, a geographic location deemed unconquerable, or a reputation forged through centuries of repelling invaders? Second, we must identify the fatal flaw. This is rarely a visible crack in the stone. More often, it is a hidden vulnerability, a strategic blind spot, or a human failing that the architects never anticipated. It could be an over-reliance on a single resource, a neglected side of the city, or a political division that rotted the will to defend from within. Finally, we arrive at the moment of breach. This is the precise incident, the ingenious tactic, or the catastrophic error where theory met reality and the impossible happened. It is the night a gate was left unguarded, the day a new weapon rendered old defenses obsolete, or the hour when betrayal from within made every external wall meaningless. By viewing Constantinople, Carthage, the Great Wall, and others through this three-part framework, their stories connect. We stop seeing isolated historical events and start recognizing a universal drama. The boast, the flaw, the breach. This is the anatomy of a fallen giant, and it begins with a city that believed it was guarded by heaven itself. For over 1,000 years, one set of walls stood as the absolute standard for urban defense. The Theodosian Walls of Constantinople were not merely a barrier, they were an entire landscape of war, a statement in stone and mortar that declared the city the eternal heart of an empire. Built in the 5th century, their design was the culmination of centuries of military engineering. The approach to the city was a gauntlet of deliberate terror. First, an attacker would face a wide, deep moat that could be flooded, a watery ditch that stalled any rapid advance. Beyond that rose a low outer wall, a first line of defense for skirmishers. Then came the main event, the massive inner wall, soaring over 30 feet high and 16 feet thick, studded with nearly 100 towering projections. But the true genius was in the spacing. These towers were placed so that defenders in any two could direct overlapping arrow fire onto any point at the base of the walls, creating an inescapable grid of death. Behind this, a second, even higher inner wall provided a final, commanding position. To stand before them was to understand the meaning of impregnable. For 11 centuries, they repelled everything from Persian armies and Arab sieges to Bulgar hordes and Russian fleets. Their reputation became metaphysical. Many believed the walls were divinely protected, a literal bulwark of Christianity. The boast was not just about scale, it was about a perfect, time-tested system that had never truly failed. The fatal flaw, however, was invisible from the battlements. It lay in the slow erosion of everything the walls were built to protect, the empire itself. Centuries of internal strife, shrinking territory, and economic decay had hollowed out the civilization within. The walls remained proud and unbroken, but they were now protecting a ghost of their former glory. The stage was set for a breach that would not come from a weakness in the stone, but from a shocking new power that would render even the greatest static defense obsolete. The legend of their invincibility masked a slow, creeping decay. For generations, the immense cost and effort required to maintain the Theodosian Walls had been deferred. Imperial treasuries were drained by court intrigues and distant wars, while the population behind the walls had dwindled. Vast sections of the monumental structure, particularly along the vulnerable landward side, were left in a state of disrepair. Cracks were patched hastily, towers were not fully manned, and the critical outer moat in many places had silted up or been left dry. The physical flaw was a chronic lack of upkeep, a neglect born from that very belief in permanent safety. The walls were still awe-inspiring, but they were no longer the perfect system they had once been. They were a magnificent, aging shield, held together by reputation more than mortar. Into this moment of vulnerability arrived a force that represented a revolution in warfare. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, was a student of history and siegecraft, and he understood that to conquer the unconquerable, he needed to change the rules of the game. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban to build a weapon of unprecedented scale. The result was a monster of bronze, a cannon so massive it required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to transport it. Its stone cannonballs weighed over 1,200 pounds. This was not a tool for precision. It was a device of brute force physics, designed to do what no trebuchet or battering ram ever could, to systematically pound a section of the legendary wall into rubble through sheer, concentrated impact. The genius of the Theodosian Walls was their layered defense against men, ladders, and traditional siege engines. They were not designed to withstand the sustained, earth-shaking hammer blows of early gunpowder artillery. For weeks, Mehmed's cannons, with Orban's giant at the forefront, focused on a single section of the damaged outer wall near the gate of St. Romanus. They created a new, terrifying rhythm of war, the thunderous blast, the flight of a massive stone ball, and the catastrophic explosion of masonry. Byzantine crews worked desperately through the nights to repair the breaches with wooden stockades and barrels of earth, but each morning the bombardment would begin anew, undoing their labor. The breach was not a single dramatic event, but a gradual, inevitable process of demolition. The flaw of neglect met the new reality of gunpowder, and the psychological fortress of a millennium finally crumbled under the weight of technological change. This was a lesson written in stone dust and fire, that no wall, no matter how brilliant its design, is static. It exists in a dialogue with the weapons and the will of its age, and when that dialogue is ignored, the fall is only a matter of time. The final, brutal test came in the early hours of May 29, 1453. After weeks of relentless cannon fire, A critical section of the outer wall near the gate of St. Romanus was a shattered mess of rubble and makeshift repairs. The defenders, a pitifully small force of Greeks and foreign volunteers, were stretched to their absolute limit, physically exhausted and psychologically drained by the constant thunder of the Ottoman guns. Their emperor, Constantine XI, moved among them in the darkness, a final symbol of a dying world, knowing this night would decide everything. The Ottoman assault began with a series of probing attacks, waves of irregular troops sent to wear down the remaining strength of the Byzantines. Then, just before dawn, Mehmed committed his ultimate weapon, his elite corps of Janissaries. These were not a motley army, they were a disciplined, highly trained military order, fanatically loyal and armed with the latest technology, including early handguns. They advanced into the chaos of the main breach, where the defensive layers had been reduced to a treacherous slope of broken stone and wooden barricades. The fighting was horrific and intimate, a swirling melee on the ruins of the wall itself. It was here, in the confusion and the crush of bodies, that a small group of Janissaries found an opening, an unguarded sally port or a section of the inner stockade that gave way. They poured through, raising their flags on the inner defenses. The cry went up that the city was penetrated, and the defense, already hanging by a thread, began to unravel completely. Constantine, seeing the banners of the enemy inside his walls, plunged into the fray with his personal guard, fighting until he was lost in the chaos. His final resting place was never found, his end becoming part of the legend. The breach was not a wide, gaping hole stormed by thousands. It was a critical failure at a single overwhelmed point, exploited by a superior force with relentless momentum. It was the physical culmination of all the hidden flaws, the technological disparity made flesh, where gunpowder and sheer human will finally overcame 1,000 years of stone and faith. The echo of that fall would ripple across continents, a stark announcement that a new age of warfare had dawned, and that no wall, however holy or ancient, could ever be considered truly finished. But the story of a wall's failure is not always written in cannon smoke and shattered stone. Sometimes the most decisive breach happens in the mind, long before any physical assault begins. For this, we travel centuries earlier and hundreds of miles to the east, to a city whose defenses were woven into the very fabric of myth. The walls of Babylon were not just engineering, they were a declaration of divine favor. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing decades after his visit, described a metropolis guarded by a system that defied belief. 2 concentric walls, an outer one of staggering proportions and an inner one nearly as formidable, encircled the city. The outer wall was said to be so wide that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on its top. Between them stretched a no-man's land, and beyond the outer wall, a massive moat fed by the great Euphrates River, which itself flowed directly through the heart of the city, secured by immense bronze gates. The grand entrance was the Ishtar Gate, a breathtaking structure faced with glazed blue bricks and adorned with rows of magnificent bulls and dragons, a symbol of power meant to awe any visitor into submission before they even entered. This was the boast, a scale so monumental it blurred the line between architecture and legend. The walls were a core part of Babylon's identity as the center of the world, an eternal city protected by its gods and the genius of its king, Nebuchadnezzar II. Their reputation for impregnability was psychological bedrock, a mythologized security that convinced its people they lived behind a permanent, divinely ordained shield. This absolute certainty in their safety would set the stage for one of history's most audacious and cunning surprises. The Persian king Cyrus the Great did not approach Babylon with a vast siege army intent on scaling those legendary heights. He understood that to conquer a city that believed itself unconquerable, he would have to outthink its mythology, not overpower its bricks. His campaign was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and strategic patience. He first defeated the Babylonian army in open field far from the city, isolating the capital. Then he moved to the banks of the Euphrates upstream. The Babylonians, secure behind their walls and stocked with years of provisions, watched and waited for a traditional siege that never came. They celebrated their apparent security, their belief in their walls now absolute. This was the fatal flaw, not in the mud brick, but in the collective mindset it created. The defenders had such faith in their physical and divine protection that they grew complacent. They failed to consider that their greatest asset, the Euphrates River, could also be their greatest vulnerability. Cyrus devised a plan of breathtaking simplicity and scale. He ordered his engineers to dig a network of diversion canals. The goal was not to drain the river completely, but to lower its level significantly where it passed under the city's walls. On a night of a great Babylonian festival, while the entire city was immersed in celebration and ritual, Cyrus's men opened the canals. The Euphrates, the lifeblood and the moat of Babylon, began to drop. Persian special forces waded into the now shallow riverbed, slipping silently beneath the massive bronze river gates, which had likely been left less guarded due to the festivities and the perceived impossibility of such an approach. They emerged inside the city, seized key points, and opened the main gates from within. The breach was not a violent smash against the walls, but a silent, strategic bypass of them. The legendary defenses, for all their physical mass, were rendered irrelevant because their defenders had forgotten to guard the assumption upon which they all rested, that no one would ever dare or even think to attack in such a way. Cyrus walked into Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, his victory cemented not by breaking walls, but by revealing that the true fortress had always been an illusion in the minds of men. Cyrus's plan was an act of hydrological genius that turned a natural moat into a secret highway. He did not march his army against the towering blue bricks of the Ishtar Gate. Instead, he moved them upstream, where his engineers began the monumental task of digging diversion channels away from the main course of the Euphrates. This was not a dam to stop the river completely, a feat likely impossible with the technology of the era, but a strategic siphoning, a way to lower the water level just enough to transform a deep, flowing barrier into a manageable ford. For weeks his laborers toiled, redirecting the lifeblood of Mesopotamia itself. Inside Babylon, the mood was one of confident detachment. The city was stocked with supplies, its walls were manned, and the great festival was underway, a time of religious observance and public celebration. The river gates, the massive bronze portals set into the walls where the Euphrates entered and exited, were likely seen as a negligible concern. After all, who could attack through a deep, fast-moving river? This was the critical miscalculation, the flaw in their defensive logic. They had treated the river as a permanent, impassable part of their wall, a static feature they never needed to question. Their security plan was comprehensive on paper, but it had a blind spot the size of the Euphrates itself, because it assumed the river would always behave as a river, never as a road. On the chosen night, with celebrations at their height and vigilance at its lowest, Cyrus gave the order. The diversion channels were opened fully, and the waters began to steadily drop. The Persian special forces, chosen for their discipline and stealth, waded into the now shallow riverbed. They moved in the darkness, not under the walls, but through the very gate the river used, slipping between the partially submerged bars of the bronze portcullis or finding the gates themselves left unsecured. They emerged inside the heart of the empire, not as a besieging force, but as infiltrators already behind every line of defense. The breach was silent, sudden, and total. By the time the alarm was raised, key defensive positions were already overwhelmed, and the main city gates were being swung open from within for the rest of the army. This was a failure of imagination more than masonry. The Babylonians had secured every inch of their stone perimeter, but forgot to secure the assumption that defined it. They relied on a single, predictable obstacle, believing geography itself was their ally, without considering how that ally could be persuaded to switch sides. It is a timeless lesson in perimeter security that a defense is only as strong as its most underestimated point, and that over-reliance on any one feature, whether it is a river, a wall, or a myth, invites the very disaster it was built to prevent. Rome learned a harsh lesson at the walls of Babylon, that a brilliant mind could outwit the greatest physical barrier. Yet there was another city where this principle reached its zenith, where the fortress was not just stone and river, but intellect itself. The siege of Syracuse presented a paradox, a confrontation where the most disciplined army in the world found itself humbled not by a higher wall, but by a deeper understanding of the physical world. The city of Syracuse was a jewel of Greek Sicily, blessed with formidable natural defenses. It occupied a headland jutting into the Mediterranean, connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus that could be easily fortified. Its harbors were sheltered, and its high ground, the district of Atradina, offered a commanding view. The existing walls were strong, but they were not the legendary multi-layered masterpieces of Constantinople. Their true strength lay in the man who stood behind them, the greatest mind of the ancient world, Archimedes. When the Roman consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus laid siege by land and sea in 214 BC, he expected a conventional, if difficult, campaign. He did not expect to be fighting the laws of physics. Archimedes transformed the entire city into a laboratory of war. He designed and built machines that seemed to border on magic, warping the very reality of siege warfare. For the Roman fleet, the approach to the harbor became a nightmare. Giant cranes, known later as the Claw of Archimedes, swung out from the walls. These were not simple hooks, but sophisticated devices using compound pulleys and counterweights. They would descend, grasp the prow of an approaching ship, lift it partially out of the water, and then release it, sending the vessel crashing back to capsize or shatter on the waves. Other engines hurled massive stones and heavy timber beams with terrifying accuracy, punching holes through hulls before the Romans could even get close enough to deploy boarding planks. The land assault fared no better. From the walls, smaller engines launched a continuous hail of projectiles of all sizes, creating a lethal zone no formation could penetrate. The most legendary weapon of all, though debated by historians, was the concept of the burning mirrors. The story tells of Archimedes arranging a series of polished bronze shields to focus the intense Sicilian sunlight onto the sails of the Roman ships, setting them ablaze at a distance. Whether this specific device was real or a metaphor for his incendiary inventions, the effect was the same. He had weaponized light itself. For Marcellus and his legions, this was a new kind of warfare. They were not battling soldiers but geometry and mechanics. The boast of Syracuse was not the thickness of its walls, but the boundless ingenuity of its defender. It created a narrative of an intellectual fortress, a city protected by a mind so brilliant that sheer physical force, no matter how disciplined, seemed hopelessly primitive. The Romans, masters of the practical and the organized, found themselves outmatched by pure theoretical genius applied with devastating practicality. It was the ultimate expression of the idea that a wall is only a tool, and its true power comes from the will and the wit of those who stand upon it. Yet even this most cerebral of defenses would ultimately fall, not to a superior machine, but to a far more common and tragic human failure. Archimedes had turned Syracuse into a fortress of the mind, but even the sharpest intellect could not guard against a failing of the human heart. For 2 long years, the Romans had been held at bay, their disciplined legions baffled and bloodied by machines that seemed to defy nature itself. Marcellus, the Roman commander, came to a grim realization. He could not break the walls, and he could not outthink the genius behind them. His only remaining path to victory was to find a crack in the city's spirit, a moment of division or weakness among the people Archimedes was protecting. The strength of Syracuse was absolute, but it was also brittle, reliant on the unity and vigilance of every citizen behind those walls. Over time, the strain of a prolonged siege began to wear on that unity. Supplies dwindled, morale wavered, and factions within the city started to argue over the best course of action. Some believed in holding out indefinitely, trusting in their legendary defender. Others grew weary and began to see negotiation or even surrender as the only way to avoid a final, brutal assault. This internal discord was the fatal flaw, a corrosion of trust that no machine could repair. The breach came not with the crash of a stone or the splash of a capsized ship, but with the quiet, deliberate turn of a lock. During a major religious festival, when the city's attention was turned inward to celebration, and the guards' vigilance was perhaps relaxed, a faction sympathetic to Rome, or simply desperate for an end to the suffering, opened a small gate. They let a contingent of Roman soldiers slip inside under cover of night. It was a betrayal from within, a surrender of the perimeter by the very people it was built to protect. Once inside, the Romans raised the alarm and chaos erupted. The defensive machines, so potent against an external threat, were useless in the confusion of street fighting. The brilliant system was bypassed in an instant because its architects never imagined the threat would come from within the command center itself. Archimedes himself was lost in the turmoil, a mind that had bent the physical world to his will, cut down by a common soldier in the disorder of a city whose social walls had already collapsed. This case study stands as a profound lesson in the hierarchy of defense. The strongest stone walls and the most ingenious machines are merely tools. Their ultimate strength is borrowed from the collective will, loyalty, and unity of the society they encircle. A fortress can withstand any external hammer, but it cannot protect itself from a poison brewed in its own well. When the people inside stop believing the walls are worth defending, or when they become more afraid of each other than the enemy outside, the most impregnable capital becomes a hollow shell, waiting only for someone to open the door. The ultimate expression of a civilization's desire for security stretches across mountains and deserts for thousands of miles. The Great Wall of China is often pictured as a single, unbroken stone ribbon sealing off an empire, a definitive barrier against the northern steppes. This iconic image, however, obscures its true genius. The wall was never intended to be an impassable physical dam against every raiding party or migrating tribe. Its primary strategic purpose was far more sophisticated, functioning as an immense system of border control, communication, and early warning. It was a sprawling nervous system for an empire designed to manage a frontier, not to hermetically seal it. Constructed and rebuilt over centuries by successive dynasties, its most formidable sections combined towering stone battlements with a network of garrison forts, barracks, and supply depots. But the most critical components were the beacon towers. These watchtowers, spaced within visual signaling distance of each other, formed a communication chain that could relay a message across hundreds of miles in a single day using smoke by day and fire by night. An incursion detected at a remote outpost could be signaled to a regional command fort long before the raiders had penetrated deeply, allowing cavalry to be dispatched to the exact point of trouble. The wall raised the cost and risk of small-scale raids, funneled trade through supervised gates where taxes could be collected, and provided a psychological demarcation between the settled agricultural world and the nomadic plains. It was a masterpiece of logistical and informational dominance, yet this very sophistication reveals its core vulnerability. A system designed to control movement and gather intelligence is only as effective as the empire that maintains and mans it. When that empire grew weak, distracted, or divided, the magnificent wall became a monument to overextension, a long, lonely line that could be ignored, bribed, or simply walked around by a determined and united force. The Mongols did not merely breach the wall, they demonstrated that its true strength was not in its stones, but in the unwavering will of the civilization standing guard upon them. A wall is only as strong as the loyalty of those who guard it. The Great Wall's fatal flaw was not a structural weakness in its masonry, but a creeping corruption within the very system it represented. For generations, the Ming dynasty poured staggering resources into expanding and reinforcing the wall, creating the iconic stone fortifications we recognize today. Yet this monumental project existed alongside a court increasingly riddled with intrigue, factionalism, and financial mismanagement. Funds earmarked for garrison pay, equipment, and repairs were often siphoned off by corrupt officials, leaving remote sections of the wall crumbling and their defenders demoralized. These soldiers, posted to desolate, wind-swept towers for years at a time, faced brutal conditions, delayed wages, and a sense of profound isolation. Their morale, the invisible mortar holding the entire defense together, began to erode. This created a vulnerability far more dangerous than any gap in the stone, a human element open to persuasion. The Mongols, under leaders like Ottoman Cannon in the 16th century, were master strategists of this softer form of warfare. They understood that a gate opened by a bribed sentry was far cheaper than one battered down by 10,000 men. Historical accounts describe Mongol agents making contact with disgruntled Ming commanders or lonely gatekeepers, offering silver, promises of safe passage, or even future alliances in exchange for looking the other way during a raid. In some cases, entire garrison commanders were compromised, allowing Mongol cavalry to pass through fortified gates as if on parade. The breach was not a military defeat, but a transactional one. The wall, a symbol of imperial power and separation, was repeatedly negated by the oldest and most human of failings, greed and neglect. It stands as the ultimate testament to a fundamental principle of security. You can build a barrier of any scale or sophistication, but if you fail to care for the people entrusted with its defense, you have built nothing but a very expensive monument to your own blindness. The stone did not fail the empire failed the stone. The sea itself can be a nation's greatest wall. For the Phoenician colony of Carthage, rising on the North African coast, this was not a metaphor but the core of its identity and its security. While other empires poured their wealth into landward ramparts, Carthage invested in a different kind of fortress, a wooden one. Its power and its protection flowed from maritime supremacy, from a navy so dominant it controlled the western Mediterranean. This command of the sea lanes was their primary, living fortification, a mobile barrier that kept enemies far from their shores. Any hostile fleet would be intercepted and destroyed long before it could threaten the city itself. Of course, they were not naive to landward threats. On the side connected to the continent, Carthage built a truly monumental set of triple walls, a defensive belt over 20 miles in circumference. These walls were staggering, reportedly standing over 40 feet high and wide enough at their summit to house stables for 300 war elephants, barracks for thousands of soldiers, and workshops for arms production. It was a self-sufficient defensive city in its own right, but the heart of Carthage, its economic and military soul, was its legendary harbors. The commercial harbor was a vast, circular basin, constantly bustling with trade from across the known world. Connected to it, hidden behind a high wall, was the secret circular naval harbor, the Chthon. This was a masterpiece of military engineering, an artificial island at its center housing the admiral's headquarters, surrounded by covered slipways that could shelter over 200 warships. The entire complex was designed for rapid deployment and security, a fortified nest for the fleet that was the city's true shield. This was the Carthaginian boast, a doctrine of defense in depth, where naval power created a vast buffer zone, and the massive land walls served as an ultimate, nearly theoretical backup. The city felt protected not just by stone, but by its mastery of the elemental domain of the sea. This absolute faith in maritime dominance would set the stage for a conflict that became a direct, brutal challenge to this entire philosophy of security. The Romans, after their grueling victories in the first two Punic Wars, understood that to break Carthage, they had to do the unthinkable, not just defeat its navy, but make the sea irrelevant. The Roman siege of Carthage was an exercise in methodical annihilation. For 3 years, beginning in 149 BC, the legions under Scipio Aemilianus tightened a noose around the city with a patience that bordered on the geological. Their initial assaults against the massive triple land walls proved futile, costing thousands of lives for mere inches of ground. The Romans then shifted their strategy entirely, aiming not to storm the walls but to strangle the very life from the city. They constructed a massive fortified camp across the entire landward isthmus, a wall of their own to seal Carthage off from the African mainland. But the true stroke of strategic genius was aimed at the heart of Carthaginian identity, the sea. To neutralize the harbor, the Romans undertook one of the most audacious engineering projects of the ancient world. They began building a massive stone mole, a giant causeway, directly out into the Mediterranean, aiming to block the entrance to the commercial harbor and trap the Carthaginian fleet inside. It was a declaration of intent, a statement that Rome would not just defeat Carthage, but would erase its reason for being by turning its protective sea into a prison. The Carthaginians watched in horror as this artificial peninsula of Roman will grew steadily closer, day by day, stone by stone. Their greatest strength, their maritime mobility, was being walled off before their eyes. Yet, even in this direst hour, the ingenuity that had built the secret Chthon harbor flared to life once more. In a final, desperate gamble, the citizens worked in secret, using the very timbers from their public buildings to construct an entirely new fleet of 50 triremes right inside the hidden naval basin. Their plan was one of breathtaking audacity: to wait for a favorable wind, burst from the harbor in a surprise sortie, and break the Roman blockade. For a moment, it seemed the spirit of the old sea power might yet prevail. But the Romans had learned the hard lessons of decades of war against Carthage. They were no longer the naval novices of the First Punic War. Scipio's forces had discovered the secret shipyard project, likely through deserters or reconnaissance, and were prepared. More critically, they had identified a hidden vulnerability the Carthaginians themselves had overlooked. Just outside the harbor mouth, a shallow sandbar lay hidden beneath the waves. The Carthaginian engineers, racing against time, had built their new fleet with the materials at hand, resulting in ships that were functional but slightly shallower in draft than their seasoned predecessors. When the day of the breakout came and the new fleet surged from the Chthon, the first ships struck the sandbar. The carefully coordinated attack dissolved into chaos as vessels piled up behind the lead ships, becoming a tangled, immobile mass right in the harbor entrance. Roman boarding parties swarmed over the sides, and the last hope of Carthage was captured or burned within sight of its own walls. The fatal Flaw was a catastrophic failure to adapt to a new kind of warfare. Carthage's entire defensive doctrine was built on the assumption of naval superiority and the ability to maneuver. Faced with a relentless enemy willing to spend years and countless lives on total, static encirclement, a strategy that neutralized the sea as a domain of escape or reinforcement, the Carthaginian system had no answer. They could innovate tactically, building a new fleet from rubble, but they could not escape the strategic trap Rome had built. The sandbar was merely the physical manifestation of a deeper truth, that in a war of attrition against an enemy with limitless resolve, even the most brilliant specialized system will break when its core assumption is permanently taken away. The sandbar at Carthage was a hidden flaw that turned bold action into a trap. In the Andes Mountains, another civilization built a fortress where the very stones were meant to be an unbreakable promise, a fusion of military might and celestial order. High above the Inca capital of Cusco, the fortress of Sacsayhuamán crowns a hill like the stone teeth of a giant. Its most iconic feature is a series of 3 zigzagging walls, built in a staggering, saw-tooth pattern that runs for hundreds of feet. These are not simple barriers, they are tactical masterpieces of dry stone construction made from enormous limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons. The stones were quarried miles away, transported without the wheel or draft animals, and fitted together with a precision that leaves no space for a blade of grass between them. This interlocking, polygonal masonry does more than demonstrate incredible skill. It creates a structure with a flexible, earthquake-resistant strength, as if the wall is a single living entity rooted to the mountain. But the zigzag design had a brutal purpose in warfare. Any attacking force charging up the slope would be funneled into the sharp angles of the walls, where defenders on the high parapets above could attack them from 3 sides at once. Each inward-pointing corner became a deadly kill zone, trapping invaders in a crossfire of sling stones and spears. Sacsayhuamán was far more than a military base, however. It was a sacred symbol. Its layout mirrored the head of a puma, the animal whose shape the city of Cusco was said to represent, with the fortress as the fierce, protective skull. This connection to the divine and the cosmic was intentional, a physical declaration that the Inca ruler's power was sanctioned by the gods and that the security of the empire was part of the natural and spiritual order. The walls were not just strong, they were holy. This was the Inca boast, a seamless integration of engineering, geography, and religion that made their center of power seem as permanent and ordained as the mountains themselves. When the Spanish conquistadors, led by Francisco Pizarro, arrived in the 1530s, they were confronting a world made manifest in stone, a civilization whose defenses were built on a logic utterly foreign to European siegecraft. They saw the massive, irregular blocks not as a feat of engineering, but as the work of demons or giants, a testament to how completely this fortress defied their understanding. Yet, this monumental fusion of the martial and the spiritual would face a threat it was never designed to comprehend, a conflict where faith in stone would collide with a ruthless new form of ambition. The sheer stone teeth of Sacsayhuamán were tested in brutal combat, and they did not break easily. When a force led by the Inca commander Quizquiz made a stand there against the Spanish and their new native allies, the fortress proved its deadly design. Attackers were funneled into those zigzagging kill zones where stones rained down from 3 sides, turning the slopes into a slaughterhouse. The walls themselves performed exactly as engineered. Yet the capital fell not because its final redoubt was militarily weak, but because the empire it was built to protect had already been shattered from within. The true, fatal flaw was not in the stonework, but in the fractured social and political body of the Inca world. Francisco Pizarro's strategy was a masterclass in exploiting division. By capturing the Emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca, he performed a decapitation strike. The Sapa Inca was not just a ruler, he was the divine center of the universe, the living conduit between the people and the gods. His capture created a paralyzing vacuum of authority and spiritual crisis. Who could command the armies or organize the defense when the sun god's representative was a prisoner? This political decapitation was compounded by a silent, biological apocalypse. European diseases like smallpox had swept ahead of the conquistadors, traveling along trade routes faster than any marching army. These illnesses, against which the native population had no immunity, caused catastrophic loss of life and social disintegration. Whole communities were devastated, leadership lines were wiped out, and the very fabric of collective labor and faith that built Sacsayhuamán was unraveling. Into this chaos, the Spanish expertly inserted themselves as players in an ongoing Inca civil war. Atahualpa had only recently defeated his brother Huascar in a bitter conflict for the throne. The empire was already split by factional loyalties and fresh wounds. Pizarro allied with groups hostile to Atahualpa's faction, turning Inca against Inca. Many saw the strange newcomers not as existential conquerors, but as useful, if dangerous, allies in a local power struggle. This fatal division of loyalty meant that when the Spanish finally assaulted Cusco and its fortress, they were not facing a united empire rallying to its sacred heart. They were fighting a remnant, a faction, while other Inca groups stood aside or even fought beside them. The magnificent walls of Sacsayhuamán fell because the collective will that gave them meaning had already dissolved. It is the ultimate testament to a principle we have seen again and again. A fortress is a symbol of unity. When that unity breaks through disease, deception, or internal strife, the most perfect stones become just a pile of rocks waiting for someone to climb over them. The Assyrians did not build walls for subtlety. Their capital, Nineveh, was a declaration of power carved into the very landscape, a city designed to be read as a threat from 50 miles away. Its defenses were not merely functional, they were a core part of imperial propaganda, celebrated in royal inscriptions with a boastful pride meant to echo through the ages. The annals of King Sennacherib detail a circuit of walls nearly 8 miles long, enclosing an area so vast it could support immense gardens and palaces. These were not simple barriers. The main city wall was reportedly so broad that 3 chariots could be driven abreast along its top, a staggering highway in the sky meant for the rapid movement of troops and artillery. It was studded with over 1,500 towers, each a platform for archers and a watchpoint that gave defenders complete command of the approaches. But the true genius of Nineveh's security lay in its defiance of nature itself. The city was fed by a system of aqueducts and canals engineered by Sennacherib, channeling water from mountain springs over 30 miles away. This guaranteed a permanent water supply for the population and, critically, for the garrison during any potential siege. Here was a fortress that seemed to have answered every possible challenge, combining overwhelming scale with sophisticated logistics. It was the apex of Assyrian military thought, a machine of stone and water built to project an image of eternal, unassailable dominance. The message to any subject people or rival kingdom was unmistakable. The heart of the empire was a mountain that could not be climbed, a well that could not run dry, a fist of stone clenched forever. This was the boast of raw, calculated intimidation, a belief that sheer monumental force could guarantee permanence. Yet, this very monumentality would soon face a revolt born from the accumulated hatred of decades, a storm of resentment that no aqueduct could quench and no wall, however wide, could truly contain. The walls of Nineveh were engineered to withstand any army, but not the river they were built beside. For all its aqueducts and canals, the city's relationship with the Tigris was one of arrogant control, not respectful partnership. The Assyrian Empire, stretched thin by its own relentless conquests, had sown a harvest of hatred across the Middle East. By 612 BC, a powerful coalition had formed with one singular goal: the utter erasure of the Assyrian capital. Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, and others, peoples who had suffered under the Assyrian yoke for generations, now marched together toward Nineveh. They were not just an army, they were a reckoning. The siege was fierce and protracted, testing the legendary defenses, but the coalition commanders observed something the Assyrian engineers had perhaps dismissed. The city's fortifications, for all their height and thickness, were intimately tied to the Tigris River, which flowed along one side of the city. The river was both a moat and a potential vulnerability. After a period of unusually heavy seasonal rains, the attackers saw their opportunity. They did not attempt to scale the walls where they were strongest. Instead, in a move of brilliant, malicious adaptation, they set to work diverting the river itself. Historical accounts suggest they may have built dams or dug channels upstream, deliberately redirecting the swollen waters of the Tigris against a specific section of Nineveh's riverfront walls. The goal was not to flood the city from the top, but to attack its foundations. The relentless force of the engineered torrent scoured away the earth at the base of the fortifications, undermining the masonry. Without a stable foundation, even the most colossal stones were doomed. A segment of the wall, weakened from below, likely collapsed or became passable. The breach was not won by battering ram or siege tower, but by hydrological sabotage. It was a catastrophic failure to anticipate how the natural world could be turned into a weapon. The Assyrians had mastered bringing water to their city over great distances, but they failed to consider how an enemy might use that same element against them. They saw the river as a controlled resource, a static part of their defensive plan, never as a dynamic force that could be enlisted by their foes. In that moment, the very engineering that symbolized their dominion became the instrument of their fall, proving that a fortress which ignores the landscape it sits within is building its own tomb. Jerusalem was a fortress carved by faith as much as by stone. Perched high in the Judean hills, its natural defenses were formidable, surrounded by deep valleys on three sides. This geography made it seem like a city chosen by divine providence, a natural stronghold that had repelled armies for centuries. By the 1st century, King Herod the Great, a master builder obsessed with projecting power and security, had transformed it into a layered defensive masterpiece. He encircled the city with not one, but 3 immense walls at its most vulnerable northern approach, where the terrain was flatter. The outermost wall enclosed the rapidly growing suburbs, the second protected the main commercial districts, and the innermost, oldest wall surrounded the ancient core of the city and the towering Temple Mount. These walls were thick, high, and studded with nearly 100 towers, each a fortress in itself. But the ultimate symbol of Roman control and military might was the Antonia fortress. This was not a defensive perimeter, it was an instrument of occupation, a stark, square citadel built directly at the northwest corner of the Temple Mount's sacred plaza. With walls rising over 60 feet and 4 colossal towers at its corners, it loomed over the temple's outer courts like a stone watchdog. A permanent Roman garrison was stationed inside, with direct, guarded staircases leading down into the temple precincts themselves. This architectural statement was clear. The heart of Jewish religious life was under the constant, armed gaze of Rome. The city's reputation as an unconquerable holy fortress, combined with a deep-seated yearning for liberation, created a volatile mixture. It fostered a spirit of defiance, a belief that God would protect his city as he had in the stories of old. This conviction encouraged hardline factions to take a stand against the greatest military power on earth, setting the stage for a confrontation of apocalyptic scale. The siege that followed would become a legend, not just for its military tactics, but for the sheer, catastrophic force of the collision between an unshakable faith and an empire that could not tolerate rebellion. The fatal flaw in Jerusalem's defenses was not a weakness in its stone, but a fracture in its soul. As the Roman legions under the future Emperor Titus encircled the city in the spring of 70 AD, the Jewish defenders were already engaged in a bitter, 3-way civil war. Zealot factions, each claiming the mantle of true resistance, fought for control of the streets and the temple stores, turning the sacred precincts into a battleground. They burned each other's grain supplies, a catastrophic act of self-sabotage that would lead to unspeakable hardship as the siege wore on. This internal chaos meant there was no unified command, no coordinated defense plan. While the defenders were consumed with fighting each other, The Roman army outside worked with the cold, methodical precision of a machine. They were not a barbarian horde, they were the most advanced military engineers in the world, and they approached Jerusalem's legendary walls as a complex problem to be solved, layer by relentless layer. Their first task was to build a circumvallation wall, a massive earthwork and palisade that completely sealed the city, preventing escape or reinforcement. This wall was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, a visible declaration that the fate of Jerusalem was now a closed equation. Then, they began the systematic work of breaking the city's 3 defensive belts. Against the massive outer wall, they constructed giant siege ramps, earthen crossworks built under the cover of mobile wooden sheds called vini. These ramps inched their way up the slope toward the battlements, a terrifying, slow-motion avalanche of Roman will. Defenders rained down arrows, stones, and fire, but the disciplined legions worked in shifts, repairing damage and pushing forward day and night. Once the ramp reached the wall, they rolled forward the ultimate tool for breaking stone, the battering ram. These were not simple logs, but sophisticated engines housed in armored galleries, their iron-tipped heads swung by teams of soldiers. The rhythmic, thunderous boom against the masonry was a sound designed to shatter nerves as well as stone. The outer wall fell, then the second. Each breach led to brutal street fighting, but the defenders, divided and desperate, were forced to fall back to the final, innermost wall surrounding the Temple Mount and the upper city. Primary flaw was a tragic lack of unity in the face of a supremely organized foe. The Romans possessed a single, unwavering objective, while Jerusalem was a city at war with itself, its legendary walls rendered meaningless by the conflict raging within their shadow. The Trojan horse stands as the ultimate symbol of deception's power over stone. For 10 long years, the assembled armies of Greece laid siege to the legendary walls of Troy, a city whose fortifications were so mighty they were said to be built by the gods Poseidon and Apollo themselves. According to Homeric epic, these divine ramparts withstood every direct assault, every battering ram and scaling ladder, turning a war of conquest into a grinding stalemate. The Greeks, facing an enemy secure behind an unbreachable perimeter, realized that victory would never come from force alone. Their solution was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a feigned surrender that masked a fatal gift. They constructed a colossal wooden horse, an offering to the goddess Athena, and filled its hollow belly with their finest warriors. Then they burned their camp, boarded their ships, and sailed just out of sight, leaving the horse alone on the shore. The Trojans, after a decade of unrelenting tension, saw the empty beaches and the strange, silent monument. They debated fiercely, some suspecting a trick. But the desire to believe the war was over, to claim a tangible symbol of their hard-won victory, proved overwhelming. They breached their own walls, dragging the horse inside the city as a trophy. That night, while Troy celebrated, the hidden Greeks emerged, opened the gates for their returning army, and the city that had held for a decade fell in a single night of fire and blood. This legendary archetype teaches us that the most sophisticated physical defense has a backdoor, the human mind. The Greeks did not crack the walls of Troy, they cracked the assumptions of the people behind them. They weaponized relief, celebration, and the universal yearning for an end to conflict. This theme of psychological deception, of using trickery to bypass what force cannot break, echoes far beyond myth. It is the whispered promise to a disgruntled guard, the false retreat that lures a garrison into the open, the forged message that sows distrust among allies. The story of Troy reminds us that a fortress is a system of beliefs as much as bricks, and the most dangerous siege engine is often a clever lie, wrapped in the appealing guise of peace. The story of the Trojan horse is a fable, but its lesson is etched in stone across history. The Greeks understood that the walls of Troy could not be taken by storm, so they targeted the human psychology behind them. The horse was not a weapon, it was a delivery system for a fatal idea, the seductive notion that the long, exhausting conflict was finally over. It exploited the universal desire for relief and celebration. The Trojans, after a decade of vigilance, suspended their most critical security protocol, the principle of distrusting gifts from a sworn enemy. They willingly breached their own legendary walls to bring the symbol of their victory inside. This is the core of the metaphor, the trusted insider that is, in fact, a concealed threat. The horse was welcomed as a trophy, but it functioned as a master key, turning the city's greatest strength, its impenetrable perimeter, into a trap. The myth distills a timeless truth about security, that gates are most often opened from within, not by force from without. This happens not only through grand deceptions like the horse, but through the slow, quiet erosion of caution. It is the sentry bribed after years of poor pay, the advisor swayed by promises of power, or the populace that grows so accustomed to peace they forget how to question a stranger at the gate. The Trojan story reminds us that every fortress has two sets of blueprints, one for the stone and mortar, and one, far more fragile, for the trust and discipline of those who live within it. When the second set is compromised, the first becomes merely a very expensive cage. That seductive illusion of absolute safety is the common thread woven through every fallen rampart. From Constantinople to Carthage, the most dangerous flaw was never a crack in the stone, but a crack in the strategic mind. These monumental fortifications, for all their physical genius, created a psychological trap of overconfidence, a condition where security itself becomes the greatest vulnerability. The very existence of such massive walls often led to a cascade of poor strategic decisions that left the civilization behind them fundamentally weaker. Think of it as a kind of architectural hubris. When your capital is wrapped in what you believe is an immortal shell, your perspective on the world outside begins to distort. Diplomacy can turn to arrogance because why negotiate from a position of perceived weakness when you feel utterly untouchable? Investment might shift away from maintaining a robust, mobile field army, the kind needed to meet threats in the open and keep allies loyal, because all resources are poured into the static, symbolic heart. Most critically, the drive to innovate militarily and adapt to new threats can stagnate. Why develop new tactics or technologies when your existing solution, that magnificent wall, has worked for centuries? This is the cruel paradox. The walls designed to make a capital impregnable often made the empire that built them more fragile. They encouraged a grand strategy that was entirely defensive, inward-looking, and reactive. The safety they promised was an illusion because true security for a civilization is not a condition you achieve and then forget. It is a dynamic, ongoing process of engagement, adaptation, and sometimes humility. The stone did not fail the people failed to see beyond the stone. A wall is a permanent answer to a temporary question. Its design is a frozen moment, a snapshot of the military threats its builders understood and feared. The entire history of fortification is a relentless, silent race between the shield and the spear, a cycle where every defensive innovation eventually meets its match in offensive cunning. This technological arms race is the second great pattern behind the fall of these giants. The earliest city walls were high and thick to repel ladders, arrows, and the direct assault of infantry. In response, attackers developed the battering ram, a tool of concentrated force that could, given enough time and protection, pound a gate or a weak section of masonry into splinters. The defense answered with stronger gates, deeper gatehouses, and projecting towers to rain death on the ram's operators. So the offense evolved again, creating the siege tower, a rolling fortress that could bring attackers level with the battlements, turning a vertical climb into a horizontal bridge. Defenders then made walls even higher and dug moats to keep these towers at a distance. Attackers countered by filling the moats or building their towers even taller. Then came the art of mining, the sap. While a distraction raged above, teams of diggers would tunnel beneath a wall's foundation, shoring up the tunnel with wooden beams. Once deep enough, they would set the supports ablaze, collapsing the tunnel and hopefully the section of wall above it. Defenders learned to listen for the sounds of digging, to dig countermines, and to engage in terrifying underground battles in the dark. Each side was adapting to the other's last move. This is why the walls of Constantinople were so brilliantly layered. They represented the cumulative knowledge of 1,000 years of this arms race, the ultimate answer to every known siege technique of the classical and medieval world. But then, the rules of the race changed entirely. The introduction of gunpowder artillery was not just another step in the cycle, it was a leap to a different game. The massive stone cannonballs fired by Maime's great bombards did not try to scale the wall, undermine it, or batter it down through repeated impact at a single point. They delivered such concentrated kinetic energy that they could shatter entire sections of masonry in a single blow, turning a sophisticated defensive system into a crumbling slope of rubble. The wall's design, a masterpiece against pre-gunpowder threats, had no answer for this new physics. Its failure was not a moral one, but a technological one. It was a brilliant solution to yesterday's problem, rendered obsolete by tomorrow's weapon. This pattern repeats throughout our story. The static nature of stone is its greatest weakness. A wall cannot learn, it cannot upgrade itself. It stands as a monument to the military wisdom of its day, while the world of attack continues to evolve around it. The moment a civilization stops asking what new threat might emerge and rests its entire security on a fixed, monumental answer, it has already begun to lose the race. True security, then, is not found in a perfect wall, but in a mindset of perpetual adaptation, in understanding that defense is a verb, not a noun. The stone was always the least of it. Across every continent and every era, the most consistent point of failure was never the engineering, but the engineer. It was the human element, that fragile network of trust and will holding the entire system together. Look at the patterns we have witnessed. The brilliant machines of Syracuse were neutralized not by a superior Roman invention, but by a gate opened from within, a betrayal born from the exhaustion and division of a prolonged siege. The Great Wall of China, that sprawling nervous system of an empire, was repeatedly bypassed not where its stones were weak, but where the morale of its underpaid, neglected garrison had eroded, making a quiet bribe more powerful than any battering ram. Jerusalem's divinely ordained walls collapsed under the weight of a three-way civil war, where defenders burned each other's food supplies while the Roman war machine built its ramps in methodical silence. And high in the Andes, the interlocking stones of Sacsayhuamán became irrelevant when the empire it symbolized was shattered by disease, deception, and a civil war that turned brother against brother. In each case, the physical fortress remained, but the social fortress, the unity it was meant to protect, had already crumbled. This is the ultimate synthesis. A wall's strength is not a property of its mortar, but a function of the collective spirit standing upon it. It is a multiplier of human resolve, not a substitute for it. No thickness of stone can compensate for a failure of political cohesion. No height of parapet can guard against a collapse of shared purpose. The most perfect defensive design in history is merely a very expensive stage, and the tragedy or triumph that unfolds there depends entirely on the actors. When those actors are united, vigilant, and believe in what they defend, the walls become an extension of their will, a formidable expression of a community's choice to endure. But when suspicion replaces loyalty, when personal gain outweighs collective survival, or when weariness erodes vigilance, then the mightiest ramparts become a prison, their gates waiting only for the first hand to turn the lock from the inside. This shifts our entire understanding of security. We have spent millennia perfecting the architecture of barriers, But the real challenge, the enduring one, lies in the far more difficult architecture of trust. The logic of the wall is a blueprint for the human mind. We still build them not just from stone and steel, but from code and policy, from treaties and early warning satellites. Our modern world is encircled by new kinds of ramparts, digital firewalls that guard data instead of granaries, missile defense shields designed to intercept threats before they ever reach our shores, and complex systems of border security that manage the flow of people and goods with a sophistication the Assyrians could never have dreamed of. These are our Theodosian walls, our Great Walls, our moats and bastions translated into the language of the 21st century. They represent the same eternal desire to create a zone of safety, to draw a definitive line between us and the perceived chaos beyond. And they are constructed with the same profound confidence in their own necessity and power. We speak of an impenetrable cyber defense or an inviolable airspace with the same tone of certainty that once described the walls of Babylon. But this forces us to ask an uncomfortable, vital question. Do these modern systems of ultimate security contain within them the same classic, fatal flaws we have traced through dust and rubble for thousands of years? Is the pattern repeating itself in silicon and fiber optic cable? Consider the first flaw, overconfidence. A nation or a corporation that invests billions in a layered missile shield might, like the Carthaginians with their navy, begin to neglect other forms of defense or diplomacy, believing the primary threat has been permanently neutralized. The very existence of the shield can encourage riskier behavior, a psychological condition strategists call moral hazard, where the feeling of being protected makes you less careful. Or look at the digital realm, where a company boasting of an unbreachable firewall might grow lax in training its own employees, the human gatekeepers who remain the most common point of entry for any attack. The belief in the perfection of the technological solution breeds the carelessness that dooms it. Then there is the relentless arms race, the technological leapfrog. Just as gunpowder artillery rendered the high medieval wall obsolete, new forms of warfare are constantly emerging to challenge our modern defenses. Hypersonic missiles travel at speeds that could overwhelm even the most advanced interception systems, potentially making our brilliant shields look slow and outdated in an instant. In cyberspace, the offense always has the initiative. A single new piece of malware or a novel hacking technique can bypass millions of dollars worth of security software, because the firewall, like a stone wall, is a static answer to a dynamic and endlessly creative threat. It is designed against known attacks, leaving it vulnerable to the unknown. And finally, the most persistent flaw of all, the human element. No algorithm is perfect, and every system, no matter how automated, is ultimately built, monitored, and used by people. A tired analyst might miss a crucial blip on a radar screen. A well-meaning employee might click on a phishing email, handing the keys to the kingdom to a digital intruder just as surely as a bribed sentry opened a gate. Political divisions or bureaucratic inertia can fracture the unified command needed to respond to a crisis, mirroring the civil strife that doomed Jerusalem and Syracuse. The firewall does not fail because the code was weak, but because the culture of vigilance around it eroded. We are not so different from the ancients gazing up at their monumental ramparts. We still seek that definitive, permanent solution to the problem of threat. We still build our walls, believing that this time, with our advanced science and our complex systems, we have finally solved the puzzle of permanent security. But history whispers a cautionary tale through every fallen stone. It suggests that the quest for an impregnable defense is perhaps a mirage, a distraction from the harder, more enduring work of building resilient, adaptable, and unified societies. The real fortress was never the wall itself, but the wisdom to know its limits. The story of these fallen giants reveals a profound and unsettling truth. Our investigation across millennia shows that the failure of an impregnable fortification is almost never a simple story of a weaker wall meeting a stronger hammer. It is a symphony of collapse where multiple movements, psychology, technology, and human nature all play their part in the final, crushing chord. The walls themselves were engineering marvels, often as strong as their builders believed them to be. Their true weakness was not in the stone, but in the powerful, dangerous illusion of absolute security they created. This illusion bred overconfidence, which led to strategic blindness, which invited the very disaster the walls were meant to prevent. They failed not because they were weak, but because they were too successful at making people feel safe. The ultimate lesson, written in the dust of Constantinople and the silent stones of Sacsayhuamán, is that no wall, no matter how grand its scale or brilliant its design, can ever be stronger than the society it protects. A fortress is a reflection of the community behind it, its unity, its vigilance, its adaptability. When that community is strong and wise, the wall amplifies its will. When that community fractures, grows complacent, or turns inward, the mightiest rampart becomes a tomb. So we are left with a question not of ancient history, but of enduring principle. Which of these seemingly impregnable systems captures your imagination the most? Was it the layered genius of Constantinople, or the tragic division within Jerusalem? Share your thoughts below, and if you can think of another legendary fortress whose story of ultimate failure should be told, let us know. The conversation about how we protect what we value and the illusions we build along the way is one that never really ends.